Today on Capecchi's Corner, we're going to look at division properties of exponents, and today's day 1. Let's first look at the properties of exponents that we're going to be working with today. The first is the zero exponent, which means that anything we raise to the zero power is going to be equal to 1, as long as a is not equal to 0. So, for example, if x is raised to the zero power, that's equal to 1. If 4 is raised to the zero power, that's also equal to 1. Our next property is the quotient of powers. And what it says is that if I have a fraction, if I'm dividing, meaning quotient is an answer to a division problem, and my base is the same, I'm simply going to subtract the exponents. So for example, if I have a to the 7th over a to the 5th, I'm going to have a to the 2nd because 7 minus 5 gives me 2. It will also hold true in the reverse. So if I had a to the 5th as my numerator and a to the 7th on the bottom, I'm going to subtract as well. And since I have more a's on the bottom because I have 7 versus 5 on the top, I'm going to be left with 2 a's on the bottom. So my answer there is going to be 1 over a squared. Now my last property for today is power of a quotient, which means if I have a fraction and it is raised to a power, then I'm going to raise both my numerator and my denominator to that power, as long as my denominator, in this case b, is not equal to 0. So for instance, if I have the fraction 3/4 and I have that squared, I'm going to take my numerator, which is 3, and square it. And then I'll take my denominator, which is 4, and square that as well. So my final answer there is 9 over 16. Now, of course, I'll always look to see if I can simplify my fraction. In this case, I can't, so there's my final answer. So now we're just going to practice these properties with the following problems, and the directions ask us to simplify. So in number 1, it says y to the 0 power. Now remember, everything to the 0 power is equal to 1, so my answer is simply just 1 there, because y to the 0 is equal to 1. Same thing with number 2. Although I have it in parentheses, 3x y to the squared, that whole term is raised to the 0 power, so my answer is 1. Now 4 is going to be a little different. In working with exponents, order of operations is very important. So in parentheses, I have 4xy, z to the 3rd, raised to the 0 power. So that will be 1. However, I can't forget about this negative. That's saying take negative 1 times what I have in the parentheses, which is 1. So my final answer in this case is negative 1. In number 5, again, that 0, my exponent is only attached to the x, so that's going to be 1. But I'm going to take 7 times 1 since I have that 7 up front. So my final answer there is 7. In number 6, again, the 0 is only attached to my base, which is x, so that's 1. And I'm going to multiply that by negative 9. So I have negative 9 times 1 is going to give me negative 9 as my final answer. And moving on, number 7, I have 5 to the 7th over 5 to the 4th. So my bases are the same, so I basically just have to subtract my exponents. My base stays the same at 5, and I have 7 minus 4, so that gives me 5 to the 3rd. Now I am going to want to take 5 to the 3rd, and that simplifies to 125. And number 8, it's slightly different. I have x to the 6th over x to the 8th, and again, I have more x's on the bottom. So when I subtract this time, my higher value is going to be on the bottom, so I end up with 1 over x to the 2nd. And number 9, again, I have a fraction raised to a power, so I'm going to take 2 to the 3rd over 3 to the 3rd. Both the numerator and the denominator get raised to the 3rd power, so I have 2 to the 3rd is 8 over 3 to the 3rd, which is 27. So there's my final answer, 8 over 27. In number 10, I have to be careful because of that negative sign. So again, I have a fraction raised to a power, so I'm going to take my numerator, which is negative 3, raise it to the power of 2. Same thing with my denominator, x raised to the 2nd power. So negative 3 squared, I have to be careful. That's positive 9, not negative 9, right? Because negative 3 times negative 3 gives me positive 9 over x squared. So there's my final answer right there. In number 11, I have 2 fractions, which I'm going to multiply. Now remember, when multiplying fractions, I multiply my numerators, and then I multiply my denominators across, and then I simplify. So in first, just looking at my numerators, I have 3 times 12, which gives me 36. And I have x to the 3rd times x to the 2nd. Remember, that's when I add exponents, so I get x to the 5th, y times y gives me y to the second. All over. Now, when I multiply my denominator, I want to line them up with my coefficient and my variables with what I have in the numerator. It just makes it a little easier for me to simplify in the end. So that gives me 4, and I have x, y to the third. So now when I simplify, I do have to be careful. 36 divided by 4, that gives me 9. A lot of students get confused and think you have to subtract because that's your rule with your exponents, but they're just numbers. So that property that you've always done just stays the same. 36 divided by 4 gives me 9. Now, when I'm looking at my x's, I have x to the fifth over x, which leaves me with x to the fourth as a numerator, right? 5 minus 1 gives me 4. And when I'm looking at my y's, I have y to the second over y to the third. Now I have more y's on the bottom, so when I simplify, I'm going to be left with y on the first on the bottom. So there's my final answer right there, 9x to the fourth over y. Now number 12, I'm not multiplying, but I do have a lot going on there, so I have to be careful. So again, when I'm looking at my coefficients, 4 over 6, that simplifies to 2/3. So I'm going to put 2 as my numerator, 3 as my denominator. Now when I look at my x's, I have x to the fifth over x, which is going to leave me x to the fourth. When I look at my y's, I have y over y to the third, so I'm left with more y's on the bottom, so my answer is going to end up there, so I have y to the second. And if I look at my last variables there, z, I have z to the seventh over z to the seventh, so that's going to just simplify to 1, so I don't need to write z at all. So my final answer is 2x to the fourth over 3y squared. Now let's look at our last problem for today, number 13. So again, remember when I have a fraction, every coefficient and every variable is raised to that power. So my numerator, I'm going to get 3 to the third, a to the sixth, remember a power to a power, I multiply, and then my denominator is b, so it's really b to the first, multiply that by 3, so I get b to the third. Now 3 to the third is 27, so I have 27, a to the sixth, b to the third is my final answer.